He held his daughter's hand, walking her toward the man she loved, unaware that the groom was about to pull off a white glove and expose the blood-stained secret he had spent 20 years burying in the ashes. The towering stained-glass windows of St. Jude's Cathedral cast long, crimson shadows across the marble aisle, painting the white lace of Maya's wedding dress in what looked like fresh blood. Soft organ music filled the vaulted hall, but beneath the harmonious chords, a suffocating silence hung over the 200 high society guests sitting in the pews. Maya tightened her grip on her father's arm, feeling the frantic, irregular pulse beating through his formal suit sleeve. Arthur Vance, a respected former judge known throughout the state for his unyielding composure, was trembling so violently that his knees seemed on the verge of buckling. Maya glanced up at his sharp profile, noticing the pale, clammy sheen on his forehead and the desperate way his eyes darted toward the altar. Was it simply the emotional weight of giving away his only daughter, or did her father know that the man waiting at the end of the aisle was not who he claimed to be? Standing at the altar, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal tuxedo, stood Julian Vance, a man who had entered Maya's life 18 months ago like a quiet storm, offering a sense of safety she had never known. Julian's left hand was clad in a pristine white silk glove, a familiar accessory he always wore due to what he had casually described as a sensitive skin condition from a childhood accident. As Arthur took the final step and brought Maya face to face with her bridegroom, the music died down, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing in the cavernous church. Julian did not offer a traditional smile. Instead, his gaze locked onto Arthur with a cold, piercing intensity that sent an icy shiver straight down Maya's spine. Before the priest could utter the opening prayer, Julian slowly raised his left hand, pinched the tip of the white glove, and peeled it off, revealing a hideous, star-shaped keloid burn scar that stretched from his knuckles up into his wrist. Arthur gasped, a hoarse, rattling sound of pure terror, and staggered backward 2 steps, letting go of Maya's arm as if he had just touched a burning iron. Why would the sight of a scar on a young man's hand drain every drop of blood from a former judge's face? Maya looked back and forth between the 2 men, the air in her lungs freezing solid as the ambient temperature in the cathedral seemed to drop into sub-zero territory. She knew her father was a man built on secrets, a man who had raised her inside a heavily guarded estate following the tragic cabin fire that took her mother's life 20 years ago. At 26, Maya had built a life as a meticulous architectural restorer, a career born from her obsessive need to fix broken historical things because her own childhood felt so utterly fractured. She was rational, cautious to a fault, and plagued by a recurring nightmare of thick smoke, screaming voices, and the smell of burning pine that she could never fully reconcile with her father's gentle bedtime stories. She had spent her entire youth walking on eggshells around Arthur, loving him deeply for his devotion, yet constantly terrified of the dark room at the end of their hallway that remained locked for 2 decades. Could it be that the nightmare she had carried in her subconscious for 20 years was not a dream at all, but a real memory that her father had spent her entire life trying to erase? Julian had been the first person to make her feel like she wasn't crazy for questioning her family's sanitized past. When they met during a restoration project at the city's historical archive, he was soft-spoken, deeply empathetic, and possessed an extraordinary knowledge of old estate records and property deeds. He listened to her late-night anxieties without judgment, offering a steady shoulder while asking remarkably specific questions about her father's early legal career and financial transactions from the late 90s. At the time, Maya had mistaken his intense curiosity for genuine interest in her family's legacy, feeling flattered that someone cared so deeply about her origins. But as their relationship accelerated toward marriage, Arthur's initial warmth toward Julian curdled into paranoid suspicion, culminating in her father hiring private investigators to stalk his future son-in-law. Was Julian truly the gentle savior who had helped her break free from her father's overprotective cage, or had he meticulously engineered their entire romance from the very beginning? The silence in the cathedral stretched to a breaking point as the guests began to murmur, sensing the profound tension crackling between the altar and the pews. Julian held his scarred hand out in the open light, the pale tissue glistening under the chandeliers like a permanent mark of violence. "You recognize it, don't you, Arthur?" Julian's voice echoed off the stone walls, calm and devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "You spent 20 years believing that the fire wiped away every trace of what happened in that cabin, but flesh remembers what the mind tries to forget." Arthur's hands shook so badly he had to grip the edge of the nearest wooden pew, his knuckles turning chalk white as he stared at the scar as if seeing a ghost risen from the grave. Maya took a step toward Julian, her bridal veil fluttering in the draft, her voice cracking as she begged him to explain what was happening. Julian turned his eyes to her, softening for a fraction of a second before pointing a finger directly at her father's chest. Ask him who was locked in the cellar before the match was thrown, Maya. Ask your hero father who he left to burn. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests, followed by the frantic whispering of high society matriarchs and prominent city officials. Maya turned to her father, expecting him to roar in defense, to threaten legal action, to display the formidable courtroom authority that had defined his career. Instead, Arthur looked utterly defeated, his head slumped, tears welling in his aged eyes as he opened his mouth, but no sound came out except a weak, choked sob. Maya felt the ground swaying beneath her feet. Her father's silence was worse than a confession, validating every seed of doubt that had been planted in her mind over the past 72 hours. Just 3 days before the wedding, Maya had intercepted a thick manila envelope delivered to their estate, intended exclusively for her father's hands. Inside were surveillance photographs showing Julian meeting secretly in dark parking lots with Evelyn Vance, Arthur's estranged, vengeful sister, who had been disinherited and erased from the family fortune decades ago. Why was the man who claimed to love Maya meeting in secret with her father's bitterest enemy just days before their wedding? When Maya had confronted Julian about the photographs 2 nights ago, he had offered a tearful, convincing explanation that had temporarily disarmed her doubts. He claimed that Evelyn had approached him with shocking court documents, alleging that Arthur had fraudulently seized the entire family inheritance by framing Evelyn for financial crimes. Julian swore he was only meeting Evelyn to protect Maya, trying to buy off her bitterness so she wouldn't ruin their wedding day with scandal and public lawsuits. Maya had wanted so desperately to believe him, wanting to protect her fragile dream of a normal, happy family away from the suffocating shadows of the Vance estate. But now, standing at the altar in her wedding dress, looking at the scar on Julian's hand and the terror in her father's eyes, she realized both men had been feeding her carefully crafted versions of the truth. If Julian was secretly working with her disinherited aunt, was his love for Maya nothing more than a calculated weapon designed to destroy Arthur from the inside out? Julian stepped away from the altar, taking a microphone from the podium so his voice resonated clearly through every speaker in the church. 20 years ago, Arthur Vance was an ambitious young attorney, desperate for capital to fund his judicial campaign and buy out his family's timber empire, Julian declared, his eyes flashing with a cold, surgical fury. My father was his business partner, a man who refused to participate in Arthur's fraudulent land grabs. When my father threatened to go to the authorities, the cabin in the woods conveniently caught fire in the middle of the night, taking my father's life and nearly taking mine. Julian raised his scarred hand higher, ensuring every camera phone being discreetly lifted in the pews captured the image. Arthur framed my father for setting the fire himself out of madness, collected the massive insurance payout, bought his judgeship, and raised Maya on blood money. The crowd erupted into horrified murmurs, several prominent donors standing up in shock as the squeal of feedback from the microphone cut through the sanctuary. Maya felt as though her chest was being crushed under an invisible weight. Was the noble father who had kissed her goodnight every evening actually a cold-blooded murderer who built his career on the ashes of his partner? Arthur slumped forward, falling to his knees on the carpeted steps of the altar, clutching his chest as tears rolled freely down his wrinkled cheeks. That's not how it happened, Julian, Arthur gasped out, his voice barely audible over the rising commotion in the pews. You were just a child. You don't know what she did. You don't know what really happened in that room. Julian sneered, pulling a yellowed, blood-stained paper from his inner jacket pocket and holding it up for everyone to see, a handwritten confession allegedly signed by Arthur's late wife, Elena, detailing Arthur's financial desperation before the fire. Maya stared at her mother's delicate handwriting on the decaying paper, her mind racing back to the hidden envelope she had found in her father's safe just yesterday. That envelope had contained a second set of medical records from the night of the fire, records that showed something Julian hadn't mentioned. Arthur had suffered third-degree burns across his own back and arms that night, burns that required months of skin grafts. If Arthur was the cold-blooded killer who set the fire and fled, why had he risked his own life entering the inferno? Maya stepped between the two men, her voice cutting through the chaos with sudden, sharp authority. "Stop, both of you, stop," she commanded, her hands trembling as she pointed at the yellowed paper in Julian's hand. "Julian, where did you get that document? My mother's personal journal was sealed in a bank vault that only 2 people had access to, My father and my Aunt Evelyn. Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second, a subtle flickering in his eyes that did not escape Maya's trained eye for detail. From the back row of the cathedral, a tall woman in an elegant navy coat stood up, her dark glasses failing to hide the triumphant smile curling across her lips. Evelyn Vance herself had arrived to witness the execution of her brother's reputation. Maya looked at Evelyn, then at Julian, and suddenly a terrifying realization clicked into place like a key turning in a rusty lock. The gold signet ring resting on Julian's pinky finger, the ring she had assumed was a family heirloom, bore the exact same crest as the wax seal on the extortion letters Evelyn had sent Arthur for years. Was Julian truly the innocent victim seeking justice for his murdered father, or was he an accomplice in a far more sinister plot orchestrated by Evelyn to seize the Vance fortune? The cathedral was dead silent now, every eye fixed on the young bride standing in the middle of the altar, refusing to play the role of the passive victim. Maya took 2 steps toward Julian, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that chilled him more than her father's terror ever could. "You told me you grew up in a state orphanage in Chicago after your parents died in an accident," Maya said, her eyes narrowing as she recalled every detail of their late-night conversations. "But 3 weeks ago, when we visited my family's old summer house, you automatically knew where the hidden water shutoff valve was in the cellar, a valve that wasn't on any architectural blueprint." Julian's jaw tightened, his steady composure finally showing a hairline fracture as he pulled his hand back, attempting to slip the glove back over his scarred wrist. "I researched the house, Maya," Julian claimed quickly, his tone shifting from righteous crusade to defensive calculation. "I had to know the layout of the place where my life was destroyed." Maya shook her head, a cold laughter bubbling up in her throat as the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. "No, Julian, you didn't research it. You knew where the valve was because you weren't locked in the cellar that night. You were the one who was holding the kerosene." An audible gasp went through the church, and even Evelyn stepped back in the aisle, her triumphant smile vanishing in an instant. Maya turned to her father, who was still weeping on the floor, looking broken and withered under the harsh cathedral lights. "Father, look at me," Maya demanded, her voice trembling with emotional exhaustion. "Tell me the truth right now, in front of God and everyone here who set the fire 20 years ago." Arthur lifted his head, his eyes haunted by a grief so deep it seemed older than time itself, and finally let the truth escape his lips. "It wasn't your mother's business partner, and it wasn't me," Arthur sobbed, reaching out a shaking hand to pull a worn, laminated photograph from his pocket, a photo of a young Elena holding 2 toddlers. "Your mother suffered from severe, undiagnosed postpartum psychosis after you were born, Maya. She was drowning in financial debt from secret gambling addictions that Evelyn had enabled and funded." Arthur pointed a trembling finger at Evelyn in the back of the church. "Evelyn used your mother's debt to try and force me to surrender my share of the inheritance, threatening to expose Elena's instability to the public and destroy our family." Julian looked confused, his eyes darting frantically between Arthur and Evelyn, the script he had memorized for years suddenly falling apart in his hands. "No, that's a lie," Julian shouted, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. "Evelyn told me my father died trying to stop Arthur." Arthur shook his head violently, tears pouring onto his collar as he revealed the devastating core of the tragedy. "Your father was Elena's secret half-brother, Julian, a man who spent that entire night trying to help me calm her down." Arthur choked out, his voice raw with decades of suppressed agony. "Elena locked herself in the cabin nursery with both of you children, convinced that the world was too evil for you to live in. She poured the fuel herself. I threw myself through the window into the flames, clawing through the burning timber to pull you both out." Arthur looked directly at Julian's scarred hand. "I pulled Maya out first because she was closest to the window, and when I reached back into the flames for you, Julian, the beam collapsed on your arm. I dragged you out, but the heat, the smoke, Elena and your father didn't make it." The revelation hung in the heavy church air like poison gas, leaving Julian motionless, staring down at his scarred hand as if seeing it for the very first time. If my father didn't die because of you," Julian whispered, his voice cracking like a child's, "then why did you pay off the fire marshals to seal the records? Why did you make everyone believe it was an arson committed by my father?" Arthur looked up at Maya with profound, sorrowful love, the tears blurring his vision. Because if the truth came out, Elena's memory would have been destroyed. Maya would have grown up knowing her own mother tried to burn her alive, and Evelyn would have used the scandal to ruin us all. Arthur confessed, his voice barely a whisper. I gave Evelyn millions of dollars over 20 years to keep her silent, to protect Maya's sanity, and I secretly funneled money into your trust fund, Julian, to ensure you were cared for, but Evelyn found you first. Arthur pointed at his sister, who was now slowly backing toward the double doors of the cathedral. She tracked you down in the foster system, fed you a distorted, twisted story of revenge, and turned you into her weapon to finally take everything I had left. Julian turned his head toward Evelyn, his eyes wide with a horrific realization as the woman he had trusted as his savior made a desperate dash for the church exit. Before she could reach the heavy brass handles, two plainclothes police officers who had been discreetly seated in the back pew stepped forward, blocking her path and snapping handcuffs around her wrists. Maya walked slowly toward Julian, stepping over her discarded bridal veil that lay crumpled on the aisle floor like a fallen flag. She stood inches from the man she was supposed to marry, looking past the handsome face and into the eyes of a boy who had been built entirely out of lies and borrowed hatred. "You didn't fall in love with me, Julian," Maya said softly, her voice filled with a devastating combination of pity and absolute finality. "You fell in love with the idea of taking away my happiness because you thought I stole the life you deserved." Julian looked down at his ungloved, scarred hand, big tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and dripping onto his pristine tuxedo jacket. "Maya, I didn't know," Julian choked out, reaching a trembling hand toward her, but stopping inches away from her lace sleeve. "I thought I was fixing what was broken. I thought I was giving my father justice." "You weren't fixing anything, Julian," Maya replied gently, pulling off her engagement ring and placing it into his scarred palm, closing his fingers over it. "You were just lighting another match." Maya turned her back on her groom, walking past the stunned, silent crowd of guests who watched in awe as the grand fairy tale crumbled into raw, unvarnished human truth. She walked down the altar steps, knelt beside her father, and helped the old, broken man to his feet, wrapping his arm securely around her shoulder. Together, father and daughter walked down the long cathedral aisle, leaving behind the lies, the fortune, and the ghosts of the past that had bound them for 20 years. As they stepped out into the bright, blinding sunlight outside the church, the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind them, sealing the horror inside the shadows where it belonged. For the first time in her life, Maya took a deep, clear breath of fresh air, realizing that while the past could never be unburned, the truth was the only foundation upon which a real life could ever be restored. In the end, the darkest secrets we keep to protect the people we love often end up becoming the very weapons that destroy them. True protection does not come from burying the painful truth in the ashes of the past, but from having the courage to face the flames together before they burn down everything we hold dear. How would you have reacted if you uncovered a secret this devastating on your wedding day? Would you be able to forgive a parent who lied to protect your childhood? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep psychological stories.